Hello, welcome back to the show, and a big welcome to our new subscribers. I've just got back from Krakow where I had a lovely holiday. It is the most beautiful city in Europe. It has extraordinary history, sometimes traumatic history. We went to Oskar Schindler's factory where he saved thousands of Jewish lives during World War II. We also went to the Auschwitz camps, which was a very sobering experience. We went down salt mines, we did a lot of fun things as well. And I was thinking, this show is the best book show on YouTube, as far as I'm concerned, for giving you history. I'm going to give you a lot of literary history. I'm going to give you a lot of publication history. I have a fantastic book for you today. But before I begin, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and you'll support the show and have all the episodes coming straight to your inbox. Okay, our book for today is Shadow Man, The Life and Times of Dashiell Hammett by Richard Layman. Now, Richard Layman is the foremost Dashiell Hammett scholar working today, and he's also a close friend of many decades of James Ellroy, and James Ellroy has always been inspired by his scholarship. And that's what we talk about on this show, is how Ellroy takes inspiration from these books that I talk about one by one. So a little bit about the biography. Richard Layman had wanted to write a biography of Dashiell Hammett. It was his first project of this type. By the way, this is not the Richard Layman, the horror writer. This is a different Richard Layman. But at the time he was writing in the late 1970s, Lillian Hellman, Dashiell Hammett's life partner, was still alive. And through various wranglings of Hammett's will, she had managed to purchase the copyrights of all of Hammett's work. She also believed that she had sole rights to any authorized biography or any biography. So Layman found it very difficult to work with her. In fact, he didn't work with her. She told every one of Hammett's friends who was still in her circle not to cooperate with Richard Layman on this biography. She told the Hammett family not to cooperate with Richard Layman. And most of the people she spoke to agreed. Well, I wouldn't say they agreed with her, but they decided to comply with her wishes. Richard Layman had very little contact with these people. She was working on an authorized biography of her own. She'd sacked the first biographer, then she was working with Diane Johnson as a novelist and biographer. But Richard Layman picked up to the post, so there was a nice story to that. And he actually said, although she'd placed this big limitation on me, it was also quite liberating in a way that having no contact with her left me free from her control. And there were still many people in Dashiell Hammett's life outside of her circle who we could talk to. Lillian Hellman died a couple of years later, and her authorized biography had come out a year before her death. So she did live to see that biography, which she put two biographers through the ringer for. And with her death, Layman actually managed to then develop good relationships with all of the people he'd previously been barred from talking to. So let's talk about the narrative of the book. This is a very lean and clean biography. Layman doesn't assume anything. He sticks to the facts as they were known throughout, and whatever he can prove and whatever is sourced, and he keeps speculation to a minimum. So we have Dashiell Hammett's life, the key stories, his work as a detective in the Pinkerton Detective Agency, his numerous assignments, how those assignments affected his later literary contribution. He manages to tie almost every assignment that Hammett talked about, and of course he takes them with a pinch of salt, and then tie it to his fiction. There is also, riveting accounts of Hammett's service in the U.S. Army in World War II in the Aleutian Islands, and Hammett was like 47 when he got into the army. He wanted to serve. His politics was already drifting to the far left by this point, but he saw World War II as an essential global battle in the fight against fascism and Nazism, and he was determined to serve, even though he had awful tuberculosis. His health was often fragile. He exacerbated his health issues with his excessive smoking, his excessive drinking. And once he achieved literary success, first as as a contributor to Black Mask magazine, which was the great pulp magazine in the 1920s and 30s, writing his Continental Op short stories. Then as a novelist, the four great novels: Red Harvest, The Maltese Falcon, The Dane Curse, The Glass Key, and subsequently The Thin Man, which became one of the biggest Hollywood franchises of the time. He had plenty of money. He stopped writing. He went through complete burnout. He kept promising Alfred A. Knopf that he would work on another novel. He made absolutely no progress. And the book is actually a very, very sad book in that sense. It is a melancholy biography because you can't help coming away from it thinking Hammett had so much more to give, or we certainly wish he had a lot more to give. And he didn't. He surrendered to his vices of alcoholism and an addiction to the good life. He says he wanted to live flamboyantly because he was brought up modestly. And there's a lot about his womanizing, his failed marriages, his long relationship with Lillian Hellman, which was based on genuine love. There is a very brief account of a time he was accused of rape, but Layman's style is to keep everything strictly to the facts. So he doesn't really come down on whether he thinks it was a plausible accusation or not. If this biography was being written today, and Layman has often said that he'd like to rewrite it, I think in the age of Me Too we would see a lot more investigation of the claim. Hammett, so Hammett lived the life of a literary celebrity. He loved hanging out with movie celebrities, Clark Gable. And even though he was finished as a writer by World War II, Hollywood and subsequently radio, which was a huge force back then, was completely just turning out his novels into films time and time again. The Maltese Falcon was filmed 3 times. The famous John Huston version with Humphrey Bogart as Sam Spade, and the screen debut of Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre, a wonderful cast. That was actually the third version of the Maltese Falcon, and by far the most successful and the most loved. They were adapted for radio time and time again, radio serializations. Hammett only wrote one, The Thin Man book, which is often considered his weakest novel. It's a light comedy, but that became a huge, huge franchise, and he could just keep cashing the checks. Instead of writing, what became Hammett's passion was political activism, and he was, pretty much on the far left. And the book is very good at saying how he suffered for this, because when McCarthyism came around in the 1950s, Hammett refused to testify in front of the McCarthy committees. He invoked his Fifth Amendment rights in refusing to testify in case he incriminated himself. But he was subsequently jailed for that. And he was jailed at a time, even though it was a relatively short sentence. And he did it very stoically. He worked, he cleaned toilets in prison. He didn't complain, but his health was already in steep decline at this time, and prison is not a good place to be ill. And when he got out, he never recovered from that, and he died far too young. But Lillian Hellman lived on for another 20 years. There's a lot about her, although his own literary career evaporated. He did help Lillian Hellman with advice. I mean, she was a fantastic writer to the extent that she needed advice. I think even the best writers need advice. He was very encouraging in her literary career. And all in all, this is a very, very fine biography. And it was the first one to come out, and it's often considered the best. Authorized biographies sometimes suffer from that lack of objectivity. My biography of James Ellroy was kind of semi-authorized. I never had a contract with Ellroy, but we worked closely together, and I'm glad he didn't put any. He had 1 or 2 rules, but there were nothing like what Lillian Hellman put on her biographers and tried to put on Richard Layman, even though he wasn't her biographer. And, okay, some stories. Richard Layman and James Ellroy became, very good friends in the 1980s. And then Richard Layman revived Black Mask magazine in the mid-1980s. It was he and Matthew J. Broccoli, who's the biographer of Scott Fitzgerald, and in his time, he's passed away now, was the foremost Scott Fitzgerald biographer. New Black Mask magazine was a quarterly, and it ran for, I think, precisely 2 years, so there were 8 editions. And 8 issues, rather. And James Ellroy wrote a couple of short stories for those, and they're very good. Dial Axminster. They turned up in Ellroy's later anthologies, such as Hollywood Nocturnes, Crime Waves, Destination Morgue. Ellroy's first marriage, his first wedding, took place in South Carolina, which is where Layman is based. I think partly runs his own business, but has a lot of interests at the University of South Carolina, where he's a renowned scholar. And Layman was a guest at Ellroy's first wedding. Then when it came round to it, James Ellroy's archives coming up, the University of South Carolina acquired the archive. Unfortunately, Ellroy had a run-in with Matthew J. Broccoli. It was this real kind of gravelly voiced, Bronx-born New Yorker, fish out of water in the Deep South, in South Carolina. And what happened is he reduced an editor, Alfred A. Knopf, to tears over the phone in a very ill-tempered and rude phone conversation. And Layman told me about it because I interviewed Layman for Love Me, Fierce and Danger, Life of James Ellroy. And he said, well, the problem with Broccoli was he was brusque and high-handed, and I could handle him because I knew him so well, but people who were new to him struggled a lot, especially women could be very condescending. And Ellroy did not take kindly to this at all. He was friendly with the woman in question, and he rang up Broccoli and he demanded, he's like, you go back and you apologize to her now. And Bronx was like, you don't tell me what to say. And that conversation descended into a shouting match. Fortunately, in terms of, that story really made me admire Ellroy more in terms of what he was prepared to do chivalrously for a woman, for a friend who had been wronged, slighted by this man. Because in his eyes, there's no excuse for rudeness. Everyone should be extremely courteous, no matter where you're from or what you've achieved or what your role is in life. I know it's very important to Ellroy. You treat everyone exactly the same. Civility first. If you can't treat someone with civility, that's like the bare minimum he asks for. And sure, maybe friendliness and, more can come from that. So he wasn't going to let Broccoli get away with that. It looked like the deal for Ellroy's archive to go to University of South Carolina could have fallen through, but Richard Layman took over the negotiation. Obviously, he was friends with Ellroy. He made it happen. The time I spent at the University of South Carolina looking at James Ellroy's archive is one of the most happiest memories of my life. All day, sat in a beautiful library. You walk in, there was a display, an exhibition on the great Scottish poets. And then you walk into the reading room, and on your right is the typewriter that Joseph Heller wrote Catch-22 on. They have Elmore Leonard's archive. They have George V. Higgins' archive. A lot of great crime writers that Ellroy admires. And I was being brought papers every day. I got to read The Confessions of Bugsy Siegel, Ellroy's only unpublished novel. It's the only novel he didn't finish. I got to read the first version of the Lloyd Hopkins novel Blood on the Moon, LA Death Trip, which Ellroy had to extensively rewrite. It was at the beginning of his career. He was running amok in his own words. You read LA Death Trip today, and you'd have to go to the University of South Carolina to read it, but you would be stunned. That piece is so, I'd say misanthropic is probably the word. Ellroy was on a tear. He seemed like he was taking out some vengeance with the world, which is fair enough. I mean, he had trauma and he had to exercise those traumas. Unfortunately, it's not a very good book, but it was good enough that Otto Penzler and Nat Sobel from Mysterious Press said, you need to absolutely rewrite it from top to bottom. And he did. He did the work. He put aside, the kind of feelings of enmity that made him write that in that style in which he thought, I can completely change the rules of crime fiction. And Penzler was like, no, crime fiction is commercial. It's a commercial proposition. We're in it to make money. You're going to write a somewhat more conventional book. South Carolina is the most beautiful place. It was summer. It was incredibly hot. But then at night, the heat seemed to cause these very brief rainstorms were actually beautiful to get stuck in. Actually, it's actually, to be in that heat and then suddenly have to have the rain come down on you is absolutely liberating. And Layman Ellroy visited, as periodically updated his archive there. He always sends his papers. He never looks through his papers before he sends them. So that did lead to an embarrassing incident once, where I was told it was an erotic photo of one of his paramours, shall we say, had got into the archive. And that one researcher, and it wasn't me, it was a researcher who went there before me, had found the photo, not told anyone until when he visited Ellroy in LA subsequently, and then said, I found this photo. And Ellroy made some furious phone calls. I've since heard that story again. I was told the photo was actually of Ellroy himself in a slightly erotic content. Anyway, the photo is not there anymore. Not to disappoint you, not to put you off visiting the archive, dear Ellroy Scholar, because it's a great place. But anyway, that photo was removed. And I remember Helen Canode, Ellroy's wife, telling me, serves him right, because he just empties his drawers, he puts everything in there. But that's good. That's good for me, because, he didn't put any censorship on the materials, that you can read through all of his correspondence with his editors and other authors over the years. And when Ellroy visited in 2019, and for this and Richard Layman, I'll be forever grateful. Ellroy was scouting for biographies at the time. He didn't know that I was working on 2 sample chapters for Love Me First in Danger, and that once I had those sample chapters finished, completed, I was subsequently pitch them to Palgrave, get the deal to write his biography. He showed a list of potential biographers to Richard Layman at South Carolina, and he said, what do you think of these biographers? And Richard Layman was like, no, they've never written on you. You need to pick someone who's written on you, of which there are only a handful of really dedicated Ellroy scholars, maybe half a dozen. There's going to be more coming through the pipeline, because I'm actually working on a project with Nathan Ashman right now. Nathan Ashman is a scholar at the University of East Anglia, to get more Ellroy scholarship published. Layman said, you need to pick someone who's written on you. No sooner had Ellroy returned from South Carolina than he got a phone call from me, and I said, hi James, I haven't spoken to you in a few years, but it's me, and I've just got the contract with Bloomsbury to write your biography. I didn't know how he was going to take it. I thought he might say, what makes you think you could? But he'd been scouting for biographers, serendipity. He'd spoken to Richard Layman, wonderful Dashiell Hammett biographer. Richard Layman told him, you need to pick someone who's written you. I've written on him. It all came together. When I interviewed Richard, he told me that story, and I said, have you got any advice? And he's like, no, I'm just glad it was you, because you've written on him. But then he did give me some advice. He's like, well, actually, be your own man. You've got this fantastic access to Ellroy, but be objective, be independent at the same time. And I took that advice, very seriously, and I took it to heart. And, I think in applying that advice, it made my biography of James Ellroy, Love Me First in Danger, the best biography it could possibly be. And just to wrap up, this is a fantastic biography as well. And reading it, you will notice a lot of the things that Ellroy said about Hammett over the years, that Chandler was the writer, wrote about the man he wanted to be. Hammett wrote about the man who afraid he was. And other stuff he's written about Hammett, about the story that Hammett was once offered a murder contract when he was in the Pinkerton Detective Agency, that The Dane Curse is Hammett's weakest novel that doesn't make narrative sense. All of these things that Ellroy has said about Hammett really begin here in Richard Layman's biography, which is highly acclaimed. And it's my book recommendation for the week. You can't find a better biography. Okay, thank you very much. Remember to hit that subscribe button. I will see you next week for another episode of Ellroy Reads. Okay, bye-bye.